Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Darlene Sampson, and I'm a diversity specialist working in schools and organizations and businesses, just about anybody who asks me to come and support them around diversity, equity, and inclusion work. Today, I'm coming to you from my current job from the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it in a minute. But as for me, I have been working for a long time in the field of social work, and I also have a doctoral degree in education. So I blend the two together nicely because it's so helpful to know human history, how people think, but also create the educational part so I can support teachers in particularly supporting kids of diversity and difference, but also learning about themselves so that they can also honor the cultural flavor and the backgrounds and the resilience of the students that they'll be serving. So those are my main jobs, and I'll just share with you what I'm doing briefly, and then I'm going to go into the topic of the day. So let's just start here. Let me see if I can find my information so that I can share it with you. And I want to just go briefly through all of the different areas that encompass critical race theory so that I can help you with sort of anchoring it. But first, we're going to talk about the Western Educational Equity Assistance Center. That's my main employer, but I'm also a consultant. We work in 13 states and 3 territories. And I don't know if you knew it, but there are 4 equity centers across the country. And the Western region, you can see on the map what we serve, the areas we serve, in addition to Guam, Island of Mariana, and Hawaii. So I often travel and support those areas, but I also do a lot of virtual work, especially since the pandemic hit. It has slowed down so much so that we're doing a lot of virtual work. Our focus is on civil rights, issues of race, sex and gender, religion, national origin. We do a lot of work around trauma and bullying, culture responsive instruction, specifically focusing on Indigenous students and Black students who are experiencing racialized practices in schools. But we do also some equity auditing, and all of our services are paid for by the Department of Education at the federal level. So any school in those 13 states can request the service and receive it for free. And we'll often work up to a couple years helping districts, schools, instructional leaders. We support and train just about all of those and all those people in schools. So that's the work, and it's important to know that if schools need support and they have difficulty paying for it, or they want the support of a very well-rounded team, there are 10 of us all around our Western areas that can support them. But also, I told you I'm diversity and equity consultant, and this is my business, and I'm often called to help a lot with organizations and businesses outside that K through 12 arena, or people just want to request my services in general. Today, I'm coming to you from the Diversity Equity Consultants and have agreed to provide this brief workshop, recorded workshop. Sorry, I can't be with you, but I am in the middle of doing all sorts of things on the date that was offered to me. And so I said, okay, well, you know what? I can do a recording. We have been pivoting. I'm so tired of that word. We have been pivoting all over the place, and we've had to do recordings. We're not in person. And so I agree to support you in this way. And I hope this will help you with anchoring our topic. So our topic today is equity, critical race theory, and social emotional learning. And I understand that you want to find out how all of those connect. And so I'm going to try to take you through some of the connections. And I want to thank you before I even begin to Great Education Colorado and the Peace Collective for all you do on behalf of our students, children, and families. So we never begin diversity work without having some sort of agreements. And so I'm just going to share with you some of the typical kind of agreements. It's okay to have an anxiety about race, diversity, and inclusion. That is called the pedagogy of discomfort. meaning that if we don't have some discomfort, we're not pushing ourselves, and we often aren't learning when we won't push ourselves, which really feeds into critical race theory. Pedagogy of discomfort. It will push you and make you feel uncomfortable. It's a term by Bowler, Bowler, and the discussion has to do with how this work can change us if we lean into it. When challenged, we also have to push ourselves first to understand our feelings. We don't push the group first, or we don't push the content first. We have to say to ourselves, what's coming up for me? Why is that making me feel strange? Why does that create some kind of issue for me? So think through what it is that comes up as I'm discussing, if anything comes up first. And then we have to approach the challenges and triumphs of our most vulnerable populations with a strengths-based perspective. And that's anchored in empathy and caring. So risk and truth is essential to this process. That's another critical race theory component. We can't talk about things unless we risk talking about the kind of issues that have been prevalent in this country. Take what you learn into your current space. That's important. And then we have to pursue positive intentions as a foundation for equity work, which is really a higher standard than assume positive intentions. We're just going to presume off the bat that people, even if they're challenged or they don't have the knowledge, underneath that, they do have some positive intentions. That's not the group that don't have positive intentions, but it is that group that want to learn, want to try, and are just, pushing for the work, but may not have the information. So some of what we discussed today may be uncomfortable, but the agreements help. And if we can kind of reflect back to them, it's going to be important. So I'm going to go through this PowerPoint pretty quickly, and you have it recorded so that you can utilize it at another time. And again, I'm sorry I can't be with you, but perhaps there's another time that you come in person. I'd be happy to do that. So I'm going to try to anchor this as best I can. But all of the concepts have so much research and literature behind them. And I hope you make the connection from my presentation. So, are these concepts intersectional? The answer is yes and no. So I'll start with how they work together. So critical race theory, it's really just an interpretive frame that looks at societal structures and behaviors. And it's not a part of social emotional learning. So when people try to place those together, that's about something entirely different. And you can't even rationalize some of the thinking that's out there right now. I'll tell you how there's some possibilities of connection, but it's not anchored. Critical race theory is not anchored in social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is essentially anchors how we treat each other, how we care for each other, and it normalizes commonality. So I can find similarities with you, you can find them with me, but also if we're different, that's great too. It honors the difference, but it teaches self-control and builds safe spaces. We all need that in our schools. And then equity looks at inequitable structures, systems, policies, procedures, and behaviors that are embedded. And equity and CRT are really overlapping in their thinking because they're looking at structures, where social emotional learning is sort of an individualized view of what we need to do to be caring, be in control of our emotions, care for other people. So you can see that when I have the little red dotted line, that means that there's no real clear association between CRT and social emotional learning. Social emotional learning is often always has to do with the individual and teaching caring. And outside of the individual, it's being respectful and showing up to understand who's around you. And I essentially think my mother would say it's having good manners. That's what social emotional learning is. So when you hear these conversations, all of these concepts are not the same. They're being lumped together, but it's often because people are trying to incite others, trying to make others be afraid, wow, what would we have? What kind of school would we have if we did not have social emotional learning where we teach our kids to take care of each other, respect each other? And those schools, by the way, who do not do social emotional learning, we know there are more critical issues that come up. We hear kids making racist statements. We hear kids putting down kids who need special education services. We see them making fun or bullying. And so social emotional learning really does support the structure of schools so that they are places of learning, but they're also safe places where people can be validated. So we know kids will make fun of each other and there's different issues that are happening, but the best schools are anchored in social emotional learning. So the concepts are loosely tied in, but social emotional learning it doesn't go into the structures and systems of the world and how they are challenging and inequitable. It's more about caring for each other. So those are the differences, and we need them, particularly social emotional learning in our schools. But it's pretty difficult when kids ask you about diversity and inequities, and you don't have a sense that social emotional learning is caring, but it's anchored in equity as well, because it cares for everybody in a way that meets their needs. But CRT, if I was to change this visual, I'd have CRT sort of sitting to the side. Social emotional learning has its own balance, so does equity, but equity should wrap itself around all of them. But social emotional learning should not be embedded in the CRT conversation. Go a little deeper. What is critical race theory? So the late attorney Derek Bell, he would probably be surprised that CRT is on the forefront of controversy in this country decades after he developed it. And he was a civil rights attorney, brilliant scholar, and he anchored the tenets of CRT. And so many people have added to it and expanded it. But Bell's civil rights roots created his thought process to better understand our country's history. So he's in law school and he's seeing all these systems of oppression and how they work together. And he just started to write about his experiences. So the framing, the theory of critical race theory came about as he saw the injustices, particularly to racialized minorities. Now, this is in law school. And Bell asserted that racism is so deeply rooted in all systems that there was no way he could successfully teach others the American system of justice without dissecting how all of this occurred. So that's how CRT began, as that interpretive frame, and it wants you to evaluate the foundation of this country. Our country has had many challenges. We're a great country, but we're also a country with some terrible injustices and historical spaces that we simply have to talk about because it's the truth. And so in the 1970s, legal scholars got together to really add to Derek Bell's framework, and they attempted to dissect systems and power coupled with human behavior, and really wanted to look at the interpretation of the world. I haven't seen CRT in schools. I have ran across really astute educators who really anchored in CRT and equity, and they can talk about it pretty well. But as far as it being about being embedded in a unit in a school, or being in social emotional learning, or a class on history, you don't see that a lot because there's a couple things: who the books are written by, and number two, the acceptance of looking critically at history in schools. That's a challenge. Here and there, you might find educators who really know how to talk about critical race theory. They learned it in school or they've read about it on their own. So all this talk of CRT is in schools simply isn't true. The curriculum is not written that way. Teachers are really structured in how they do the work. They have to be thoughtful and careful, precisely because of some of these issues. But I have ran into some educators who will say, now I'm talking about history of the indigenous folks, and we have to think about this concept. And this concept talks to us about power, race. And I particularly have seen it in relationship to talking about the criminal justice system. And as teachers talk about the new Jim Crow, the book in terms of discussing how our systems are continuing and being embedded and repurposed in different ways. But as far as being a part of a whole unit and taught from a perspective out of a book, no, that's not happening. So when people do that, you have to know that it means that they're trying to conflate the issue. It's a false narrative, and they're just not the same. So that's what critical race theory, how it got embedded by Derek Bell in the 70s. And it really was highlighting race because nobody even talks about the fact that before critical race theory, there was critical theory. So I think people get afraid when they hear the word race, but critical theory was the earliest anchor. And then the critical race theorists said, no, we got to put race into this because it's embedded, bias is embedded. So critical theory really grounded the work, and critical race theory became the overlay and asked how race is embedded. So that's how it started in law schools. Some of the critical race theory foundations, the principles of critical race theory is that racism is baked into the structure of our systems. Just about every system, schools, hospital, banking systems, neighborhoods, criminal justice systems, racism is baked into those systems. It means it's prevalent, it's all over. It might even be unconscious, it's just how we do things. And these systems often work together to maintain power. And then there are racial hierarchies of institutional power. So one system may trump another system, take precedence over another system. And in that way, they still maintain power, but they create systems of inequities for students. I'm going to focus on schools today because I know you focus on schools, but we could take just about any system and find out where racism is embedded. So I'll give you some examples in schools and policies and procedures. It could be how students of color are disproportionately taught in segregated schools. They have little access to equitable systems. The pandemic showed us that some kids were sitting outside of restaurants so they can have internet access, but we knew this all along, but we didn't pay attention or we didn't know what kids needed. We saw it in the healthcare systems. It could be in schools that students don't have access to AP and honors classes or gifted classes, or only certain kids are in gifted classes, often not kids of color, or they're only taught from a Eurocentric perspective. So critical race theory helps us look at all these systems through racialized practices, which is so disconcerting because race is made up. The social construct of race is made up. Race isn't real. But I could even deal with the categories of race that happened way back in the 1600s if other people didn't say, oh, well, this race is better than this race, and this race looks better than this race. This race is more intelligent than others. And so being baked in, it's way even before Derek Bell. It's been in science, it's been in history, it's been everywhere. If it's behaviors, attitudes, and blaming, racialized inequities rise up in low expectations, lack of high-level programming, and programs that actually maintain performance gaps. Black and brown students and families are often blamed for their failure to meet standards when the standards upon entering school are inequitable, biased, and culturally incongruent. If we frame the achievement or opportunity gaps as a problem of the individual, we are less likely to look at systems. So we do not have to just look at the individual. We've got to address systems barriers and racism historically, socio-politically, and morally, because it's a civil rights issue. You might see in schools language around dual language learners as if there's something wrong with someone who knows how to speak more than one language, or we'll say, oh, it's Spanish language, but there's so many other diverse languages the kids speak, or we may attribute that to undocumented folks. So it can be in behaviors and attitude and blaming. Or you can go in just about any school and see Black and Latinx students overrepresented in special education, affective needs classrooms for kids who are designated emotionally disturbed. And you may find the same kids, Black and brown kids, in the office, being sent to the office for different ways of relating. Underneath these issues are characterizing students of color from a deficit framework and refusing to understand culture and over-policing Black and brown bodies. CRT tells us to never forget or operate outside of knowing that these activities and behaviors exist and contribute to and maintain gaps. They maintain power. They maintain control and structural racism. And what's worse is our kids drop out of school. They don't feel validated. They never see themselves in the curriculum. Nobody tells them you can choose whatever you want to choose. And that's done consistently. And then push them toward those spaces so they can feel comfortable about it. There's just too many examples to list here, but I've just shared with you how critical race theory would dissect what happens in a school. But you can utilize the framework to look at so many other systems. When it's a power imbalance, this occurs when the power within schools is essentially held and anchored by white supremacy tactics, white curricula, white structures that are essentially baked in to the school. That's just how the school runs. Curricular challenges, there's some kids of color who will never see themselves their entire school years or see anybody who looks like them, teaching them as a paraprofessional, as an instructional leader. Just about every place they go, they won't do that. They don't know what their options are sometimes, or how smart they really are, because they've been hearing achievement gap, opportunity gap. However, if we look at curriculum across this country, few units are embedded with validating and affirming curriculum, especially about folks of color. And even if we do see culturally responsive teaching or multicultural education, we have to be careful to make sure it is what the it's positive, but it doesn't exoticize history. It tells the truth about history. And in critical race theory, it will tell you people don't want authentic history to be taught. If you teach a people about themselves, they're more likely to change, be empathic, caring, and change history going forward. So that's a lot of what this is about, is demographics are changing and power and privilege and structures are changing. Lastly, curriculum is often said to be responsive, but it can't be divorced from the ravages of racism. Critical race theory will tell you, okay, start talking about all these things, but you have to find out how racism is involved. So evading racism in all systems still leads to low-level thinking and low expectations. And then intersectional violence, that occurs when, for instance, a Black girl at school or Latina is treated badly because of the color of her skin, her size, how she learns, how she walks and talks. And that's gendered violence, racism, sizeism violence, and colorism. So all have roots in historical violence, but are anchored in racism. So CRT helps us to understand that we're often dealing with multiple challenges that are anchored in race and coupled with other differences. So we have to be able to see them and understand them. And I want to stress that often these intersectional violent spaces also include LGBTQ plus students. They're more likely to feel suicidal on the outskirts, feel pushed out and afraid. So when we think about all the structures of systems, you have to think about lots of diversity that's embedded in those systems as well. So I can't go through all of the theoretical frames of critical race theory, but I want to talk to you first about interest convergence. That's one of the framing spaces that's inside of critical race theory. And interest conversion, it says that those who are afraid of power will not be able to show caring or interest in others unless it benefits them. So we could have people even say, I'm so for equity and I want all these things, but no, don't take away my gifted program. No, I don't want these other kids in my IB programming. So please know that even when there are good intentions, there's unintentional racism happening. So they don't want certain kids in certain areas, or don't come in my neighborhood, but yeah, give them some equity, but just not over here. And whiteness as property informs us that history only belongs to some, and those in power desire to interpret it from their perspective only. However, the concept can be applied to institutions, policies, procedures, and attitudes that desire to maintain paradigms that only assert whiteness as the norm. So I will act as if you're my property if you step into my power space. And that's where you hear these versions of the Karens who only want certain things, or why are you selling water here? And what do you do in my neighborhood? And I'm going to lock you out of the gate of the swimming pool because I don't want you here. So property, whiteness as property covers a lot of different areas in terms of the behaviors that are happening. So we know that if we cause fear, racial division stokes fear and maintains power. And critical race theory will tell you there's all sorts of behaviors that will make sure to make you afraid, to worry, who's in my neighborhood, who's taking power, what's happening. Oh, I don't want all these kids over here playing tennis in my neighborhood. And fear invokes a lack of movement. Anxiety creates disequilibrium for the people, for both, but particularly for the folks who are marginalized. They have deep trauma and hurt. And then the erroneous belief that changing power structures dilutes and damages our country produces pushback. When we share power and care for each other, is actually the best place. And anti-CRT legislation is aligned with multiple diminished social justice focus points. So all this push moves us backward toward fearing each other, not finding commonalities, not caring for each other. And on top of that, some parents who are pushing back at school board meetings or making sure they're pushing out superintendents, they don't teach their kids about inequities at home. In fact, they live the opposite. And so kids are unprepared to learn. I recently heard about a group of kids who dressed as if they were slaves, and they had signs in the school. Well, what would happen if they were taught about the resilience of enslaved folks, the positive aspects of history and what folks went through? Would you have some empathy? But what if you went home and your parents don't have empathy for people experiencing homelessness or people that are different? So some parents don't do that. And then the murder of George Floyd created an entire movement, unlike we have seen for many years. And a lot of this is a backlash to that movement that happened. And now it's been put in place. Some of the structures that maintain white supremacy spaces, they are using legislation. Okay. And so I always tell the young folks, don't just be out there marching. You've got to have bills. You have to have policies and procedures. There has to be just as much strength toward speaking your voice as it is to maintaining it. So the death of George Floyd and the push upset the status quo. And here's Ruby Bridges. If Ruby Bridges dealt with racism at age 6, other children should know about her courage. And we should be caring about the kids who are continuing to battle and struggle in schools and not have curriculum that cares about them and not have spaces that support them. And if Ruby Bridges could deal with that at 6, we know all kids need to know about all kids. And in reality, critical race theory spoken openly and conducted successfully helps us to better understand both our painful and positive histories in this country. It could be a starting point, but we're so busy being afraid of it or trying to make it be something that it isn't. So that's what I want to focus on too, is that part of this is a game to sort of move in a different direction. It's a smoke screen, and you have to know that. But CRT isn't all things equity. It has its own background for legal scholars. It's not culture responsive teaching, culture responsive instruction that supports students in just using their knowledge as a conduit for learning. Equity is embedded there, but I've yet to see a teacher embed critical race theory into that conversation. It's not exclusively American perspective. It's taught in a lot of places. It's not social emotional learning. As I said, it doesn't blame and incite. It just simply tells the story of our country. And if that's divisive, then I think we're just not ready for the history. We want to push back against it and maintain those structures. And it's not a threat to democracy. In fact, it will open up spaces for all folks. And it's not racist. It's just the truth. So what does critical race theory ask us to do? It's asking a society to look at their history and their structures of oppression, keep them in the forefront so that we can understand what we need to do. It's asking us to care about each other. What's wrong with that? It's asking for our students to strive. So as the late great writer James Baldwin states, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So if we keep hiding, keep playing, keep not paying attention to what this is doing to our kids, we're going to have major issues. And our country's divided right now. And so it's really a challenge. And then equity simply says, treat someone differently in order to treat them fairly, because they may have not had the same starting place. And we want equity to be embedded in schools. And in classrooms, it looks like that all students can thrive, that all students see themselves, gender see themselves. There's equity. There isn't bullying. There's high expectations, and that's the norm. And we want it in these systems, individual, for ourselves, inside us, interpersonal, among each other, in our institutions, and in how we think in terms of our ideology. That's where change is embedded in those 4 pillars, if we're really going to make any leeway. And then equity is committed to giving every student what they need to get in the game. They're not standing outside the game like this group. When we have authentic equity, we won't have barriers, a gate. You've seen all these different visuals of equity, inclusion, and liberation. People aren't standing on the outside when we have true, authentic equity, nor do we need to keep discussing it all the time, because it's embedded and it's for everyone. And then social emotional learning is its own research-based space. It is totally separate from CRT, critical race theory. And it's really the process of developing self-awareness, self-control, interpersonal skills that are vital for our schoolwork and life success for our kids. And then it's positive. And we know that a lot of schools after the pandemic, and they were online virtually, they had to come back and reinstitute social emotional learning. You have to sustain it year after year after year, because developmentally, kids change and they need to learn how to reintegrate, how to care for each other. And just being offline, being online for learning for that time really caused social emotional learning to fall backwards. And a lot of schools are finding out that they had to back up. And before they even started some of their academic work, when they came back in person, they had to anchor social emotional learning to create a culture for the school that was good. And to have our kids come back, and we hear across the country they're fighting, they feel disconnected, and then the pandemic just really disruptive lives. And we already had kids who had challenges, but all of us went through a lot during the pandemic. We're still here, we're not done yet, But it really calls us to have a lot of problems. And there were other people who already had problems and it compounded their issues. So social emotional lessons, they often teach about feelings, fear and anxieties. The mental health and mental wellness of the student is important. Treating everyone with respect, honoring diverse perspectives and diverse students, recognizing your strengths and areas of growth, even thinking about careers, uh, sex and gender equity. It might focus on empathy. I would say empathy wraps around social emotional lessons, making positive choices. And you know how kids can be sort of one-sided, they don't think of others. Well, social emotional lessons make them think about others and that they aren't the only people that matter. And so, wow, aren't these good for kids? When people ask you questions or push back on social emotional learning, you can say, wow, we really want kids to respect each other. We want them to recognize their strengths. Social emotional learning is about those kinds of things. Why don't you look it up? And then this was funny to me because I've used It's Okay to Be a Unicorn for kids to think about just differences. But this author, he was pushed back. So Jason was asked to come to the school to read, but just the night before I think he got there, they're like, no, don't read that book. It's okay to be a unicorn, which means it's just okay to be different. Some parents are like, I think you might be recruited to become gay. That's not how gay happens. That's not how being gay happens. So the silliness out there and lack of knowledge, it helps to maintain the status quo and keep people afraid. But read these things for yourself, understand what they're saying. And then Jerry Craft's books are one of the books that my grandson really loves because he sees his images in them. And it's about overcoming life and dealing with challenges. We want our kids to know how to do that. We want them to know how to manage life. So anytime you see these books being banned or being pushed back, find out about them. Take a look at them. Ask what they're really about, because a lot of it has to do with that structure underneath there, maintaining the status quo, pushing back against the social justice. So we got to tell the truth. This is my neighbor's sign. And when we tell the truth, we connect with those we were talking about too. Frankly, my neighbor never connected with me. I did with him once I saw the sign. I'm like, that's a great sign. Why haven't you talked to me? Why do you look the other way when I walk down the street? So tell the truth. What are we doing in our own personal lives that connect with others? And are we doing performative stuff? We're being on committees, we're writing all kinds of mission statement. We are pushing all kinds of images, but in our own world, we don't even look at the people that are different in our world, or we don't even have anybody different in our world. So in order to be authentic, we've got to do our inside out work as well. Because our kids need people who stand for them morally. And this stance has to come from practice. It doesn't just come naturally. If we're going to dismantle systems, we have to work hard on ourselves so that we have the language and information. So here's some sentence statements. When you hear the false narratives, half the time, I don't waste my time fighting with people about it. I don't try to rationalize it because I know underneath there's something else. So if they say, oh, we don't want critical race theory in schools, here's some questions. And you'll have this recording. You can come up with your own, but most of the people who talk about critical race theory don't know anything about it. I barely gave you a quarter of what it's about today because it's an extensive framework and people don't know about it, or they know a little bit about it, but they're scared. So I also put in there what scares you about it. What don't you like? No child should be made to feel bad about history, and no child should not know history. So that will be a tough question and answer session. And in response to the equity, diversity, inclusion pushback, it's great when our kids treat each other with respect and dignity. It's great when kids know that they're each unique and valuable. It's also great when parents teach we are all valuable in their homes. That will be a good conversation starter. And when they talk about refusing social emotional lessons, I've told you what social emotional lessons are about and what they're for. I always say, don't we want all kids to feel caring? Don't we all want to show empathy for all kids? And when our kids get along, it's great for our schools, don't you think? So you have to come back with certain things, but don't spend a lot of time trying to change people's thinking, because a lot of this is complex and built in power structures and maintaining those. I still speak my truth. I pace myself because racial battle fatigue is real, but I don't try to skirt the issue. So we can disagree in ways that are productive if we stay focused and committed. Understand we're in a totally different time and space. There's more games being played about equity now more than ever, pushing out principals and superintendents and voting out this person or that person, or confronting people who demand equity. So you don't want to get in a fight with people. It is literally dangerous for some folks out there right now if they're on the forefront of pushing equity. But for me, it's always been dangerous. I walk the earth as a Black woman. I walk in my Black shoes. There are spaces and places where I don't feel safe. I don't not tell the truth, but I am still careful. I'm not going to disagree with someone who absolutely doesn't want to listen and hear about equity, because then I know they're not willing to accept me. So we still have to maintain security and find our allies. You got to have some equity peeps who support you. And sometimes it's our students because they tell the truth and we want to hear their stories. We have to help our educators. Some educators are really steeped in speaking authentic truths. And then there's spaces where if you speak the truth, you're going to be pushed out. So you have to be careful, but we can't hide. And I had a school district say, we want to still do our equity work. We're being disbanded, but can we call it something else? I think that's so sad. And I think that's the epitome of violence, is to keep people from speaking the truth or to just share what our country has been about. So we can't deal with irrational thoughts and fears. And I said, I think you keep talking about your equity charge, but you might anchor it in your data. You might anchor it in how communities are changing, or demographics, or what your school district needs. But we have to keep talking. I won't stop, but there are ways to do it that you can disagree in ways that aren't harmful, aren't mean. We should be using our own social emotional skills to help each other grow and do better. And then I just threw in some of my favorite books that I've utilized in groups with students or utilized for my own thinking. And I like these books because they're from K through teenage years. I've gone to schools to use them. They're just affirming, and they talk about differences from a different perspective. The Feelings in Control Flip book is a social emotional curriculum. And so we have to do a lot of things to help our kids understand what they're feeling. And when we don't talk to them about difference and the value of difference and embracing difference, they're less likely to understand it or feel comfortable with it or be validated because they're different themselves. So these are just a few, and you have the recording. And I feel like I've done is the best that I could to integrate and infuse some of the concepts of CRT, but please keep them separate. CRT is its own body of knowledge. Equity wraps around everything, but social emotional is so important for our kids. We cannot allow that to be pushed aside and for people to play games with helping our kids to care from each other. So thank you again for all that you do. And I really appreciate you. And please do call on me. And if you need additional support and help, perhaps I'll be available and we can have a session about what some of the work can really look like and how you can push it. Thank you for all that you do.